can tell, this is a very international panel that we're talking to. China, Singapore, US, UK, London. So let's jump directly into the conversation. According to the speech given by the Chinese premier at the opening plenary of Summer Davos, 5% GDP growth rate is guaranteed. Now, I want to go to you, Mr. Peng. How that promise will be fulfilled? What do you think are the major building blocks that would eventually deliver us that growth and hopefully good quality growth?
谢谢主持人。
谢谢彭老师。
这个总体来讲呢，中国的经济经过了。
In general terms, we've been through 3 years of the pandemic era, and got back onto a growth track in 2023. The Chinese economy is riding waves but sailing forward. In 2023, China's economy achieved 5.2% growth, so it resumed some of its speed and contributed about 30% to global growth. In the first quarter of this year, growth was higher than expected, 5.3% annual. That was somewhat better than expectations. Now, looking at these figures, the impression that they give you is that there's some recovery of a higher growth rate. Now, the complete figures for the first half of this year are not out yet, but looking at April and May, investment and consumption have tailed off somewhat in China. On the other hand, exports and international trade generally have enjoyed a quite large boost. Trade has grown at 5.0% in April. In May, it was 8.6%, so it's up 3 percentage points there. So in general terms, China's economy is on the upswing. That's not to say it's without its problems. The process of recovery doesn't yet have very firm foundations, and that can be seen in the following. Overall demand in the Chinese economy is still insufficient. Now, expectations among the public are somewhat weak. We have numerous uncertainties, particularly uncertainties that we face internationally. But in summary, I would say that moving into second quarter, the third quarter, and so on, with the support of the macroeconomic policies that have adopted, in particular the moves towards new quality productivity, and in particular next month there'll be the third session of the 20th plenum of the party, which will be bringing more good news. As China's growth stabilizes, this is good news for the world. Li Qiang, at the opening of this meeting, announced this goal that it would grow by 5.0%, and I'm fully confident that China will achieve that.
李强总理讲今年我们还是有信心完成年初预定的计划5.0%的这样一个速度。对此呢，我也是完全有信心的。
Dr. Jin, when it comes to headwinds, we see a series of debates about different factors of the Chinese economy, for example, on green economy. The latest is about the electronic vehicles. As we know, it's going on every day in the headlines of the news. Now, China has been looking at green transformation as one of the drivers for its potential of economic growth. How do you see the latest events providing us more thoughts as to both the ways and the directions of green transformation contributing to future growth?
Thank you. First of all, let's face one important reality in the world. There is a fundamental structural change that is underway that has to do with new technologies, and that has to do with climate change. And China is spearheading that structural transformation by actually starting very early. Part of the success for EVs and solar panels is that they started much earlier than a lot of the Western economies did. But this is all part of a global supply chain. Okay? China might be leading the way in EVs and batteries and solar panels, but they are all embedded in a global supply chain, and it's going to involve everybody. There's been some recent research that has shown in the last few decades, China's rise, because of the global supply chain, has also pulled up the economic development of many of the neighboring developing countries. And it's going to be the same with EVs and with the renewables actually involving more advanced economies. So to give you an example, I think this is a very important example to make note of, China is investing heavily in Europe directly, setting up plants and factories on batteries and EV platforms, and whether it's Poland or Spain setting up joint ventures with EV, taking advantage of China's technology now. The table has completely flipped to launch their own EVs and EV platforms. So this is a collaboration. Again, it might be that China is heading the way. And by the way, when we talk about demand and capacity, one of the numbers we look at, 45 million EV vehicles needed by 2040 to keep us on track of the green transition. Trillions of dollars of investment that's needed. China's going to play a very essential role.
Interesting. Professor Prasad, another challenge people talk about, of course, geopolitics. That's the elephant in the room. So I have to throw that question since you're coming from the US, but I know you're not a spokesperson for any government. Having said that, though, people in the room have all figured out the realities about that most important bilateral relations, arguably speaking, right now, already. So what is that actually change over the next few months, including election season in the US, going to have on business communities' understanding of this relationship and therefore their decision-making process regarding the Chinese economy? Please, Professor Prasad.
So there is not so good news on that front, Tianwei. Since we met here in Tianjin a year ago, I think a new baseline has been set in the US-China relationship, a baseline that is going to be very difficult to go below in terms of improving the relationship. If anything, that baseline could lead to more hostilities, more tensions between the two countries. Now, certainly, the effects of the November presidential election in the US will be very important. But the question is, what is going to change? My sense is that we're not going to have a major change in the overall approach of the US towards China, but certainly the strategy, the tactics could be very different under a second Trump administration as opposed to a second Biden administration. But the difficult reality that the two countries now face is the following. Once upon a time, the economic relationship between the two countries used to be seen as a positive-sum game where both countries could gain from mutual trade and finance. The geopolitics, of course, is intrinsically a zero-sum game. But now even the economic relationship is seen as a zero or even negative-sum game. One of the reasons, of course, is that many of the industries that China is looking forward to in terms of developing for its own technological upgrading, in terms of its own move up the value-added chain that Keyu referred to, those are precisely the industries, green technology, solar batteries, EVs, those are precisely the industries that the United States and perhaps even Europe are counting on for their own manufacturing revival. The other element, of course, is that many American businesses, many American investors now seem to have the impression that China is not quite as conducive a place as it used to be to do business, to sell into the market here, or to use it as part of their supply chains. So I think it is very important that Keyu mentioned that China can play a very important role in the global supply chain still, and it's not just about the US and China. But I think the overall framework is certainly going to be one where these two countries are not going to have the very tight, direct relationship that they had before. A point that Professor Jin made at a dinner yesterday is that it's not that the two countries are decoupling, but the coupling is now going through alternative channels with China investing in production and other facilities in other parts of the world to export to the US. So I think the reality is that we are in a much more connected world.
Right.
But because of these tensions, that connection is going to take different forms.
I've been having different conversations over the past 2 to 3 days here in Summer Davos. I will go to the question a bit later, but this is an important backdrop that I collected from our audience and participants. People have been repeatedly asking, can we be more imaginative about our world and solutions? Do we only look at the world through the entry point of geopolitics? Are there any other as important and probably even more important entry points than just the geopolitics? I think that's what the business community is also thinking about these days. So as a result, Aparna, I go to you on some of the important thinking business community are doing with your latest survey and also your research about what exactly is the role of the Chinese economy today with the world.
Yes. No,
that sounds like a big subject. You know, we can discuss for 100 years, but today very relevant. Please.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a big subject and it's something that we could talk about for hours, but let me try to distill it in a couple of minutes. The first point is that China is very important to the global economy, not just the global business community, but to the global economy. I mean, if you just look at the 5% growth that we're very confident that we'll achieve this year, that 5% growth will already add more to the global GDP than India, Indonesia, Japan combined. So even a so-called slowed down growth of China is actually incredibly relevant for the global economy. In addition to that, what we did a survey of Fortune 500 business leaders, CEOs, and first of all, of the Fortune 500, 140 are Chinese business leaders. That's an important point. Secondly, more than half of those business leaders said to us that they're bullish on China, and they continue to be bullish on China. So I think this decoupling of the global business community to China, even though the headwinds are tougher, is not something that we expect from a practical perspective. Now, I'll just touch upon a couple of areas where China's dependency, the world's dependency rather, on China is very high. The first is supply chains. I think you touched upon that already. But what I would also say is that China's already more than a third of global gross production. It's still more than a third of global gross production, and it's an order of magnitude higher than what US contributes or what Japan contributes. So China's relevance to global production is important. Now, China Plus One strategies have been very much in the media and discussions. The reality is, even if you
China Plus One, just for those who do not follow the news every day, is of course it's a supply chain. Some people want to have another option besides China. Yeah.
Absolutely. So China Plus One is essentially diversification of supply chains to provide alternative manufacturing locations in addition to China for global manufacturers. But when we analyzed at BCG what those supply chains actually look like, and you talked about dependencies in electric vehicles, behind the China Plus One, you still see China contribution to many of those value chains. So exports from ASEAN to the US are increasing, but in those exports, there's huge China business value add and China manufacturing value add. Same for exports from Mexico to the US. So China's role in global supply chains remains. And one last thing I will mention is China's role in the global South. The global South as a narrative is getting galvanized. And you see that with the expansion of the BRIC membership. You've had South Africa join the BRICS. You've seen Malaysia and Thailand apply to join the BRICS. The BRICS is going to become a de facto subset of the global South with a louder voice. And nations of the global South are looking to Chinese products, Chinese technology, Chinese partnerships. And that's not just true for ASEAN, but it's also true for Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. So there's tremendous potential for the world, if you look at the global South as well, in connecting closely to China and partnering with China. So I feel optimistic, despite the headwinds, about the potential.
Yeah. I remember in almost every discussion about the Chinese economy and economic policy, there is always a question regarding what exactly is the role of the government, whether it's government at central level or government at local level. Of course, their nature is very different. So, Mr. Peng, if I could follow up, and I think this is a must-ask question regarding that, what exactly is the role of the government? I see our other panelists already wearing the earpiece. They want to listen very attentively. Mr. Peng, of course, you are coming in from a researcher's perspective. Please.
这个就涉及到了中国目前的。
This involves a new process and prospects of China's current economic structural reforms, especially the market-oriented reforms. Because China's reforms have been carried out for 45 years, and the core issues to solve the relationship between the government and the market, it was decided about a dozen years ago that the market should be regarded as the decisive factor in the allocation of resources, and the market should play a decisive role. Resource allocation is central to determining the different economic models of society. If the government allocates resources, it is a planned economy. And if the market mainly allocates resources, it is a market economy. In recent years, we have promoted market-oriented reforms, which is to minimize the government's intervention in the microeconomy. But in the process of developing China's socialist market economy, we also emphasize that the government should play a better role, not play a bigger role, but mainly to create a better competitive environment. Especially in China, it has currently a bigger private economy in terms of quantity. The private economy has accounted for more than 90% in terms of employment, accounting for more than 80%, and the contribution of innovation accounts for more than 70%. As for its share of GDP, it is more than 60% in terms of exports, and in terms of tax revenues, it is more than 50%. There are 180 million market entities in China, including 120 million individual industrial and commercial households, and more than 35 million private enterprises. If they can compete on an equal footing, China's economy will have a bright future.
Professor Prasad, before I go to Dr. Jin, I want you also to comment on the same question.
In his speech a couple of days ago, Premier Li Qiang spoke about the need to deal with the symptoms as well as the root causes of the problems besetting the Chinese economy. And I think both of those are very important. The role of the government, I think, is crucial in all of this. And one of the difficult challenges the Chinese economy is facing right now is there is a sense that the government might not be as encouraging of the private sector as it might have been in the past. The actions that were taken in 2022 and 2023 that affected the tech sector, the health sector, the education sector, I think have left a mark. Now, the question is, what is the right role of the government? I think the government has a critical role to play. If you think about the financial system, for instance, the financial system is essential to allocate resources to the part of the economy that can generate more employment growth, that can generate more innovation, and therefore productivity growth. And a lot of innovation, a lot of employment growth has to come from the private sector, from small and medium enterprises, from enterprises in the service sector, and so on. But this does not necessarily mean that the government takes the role of allocating credit in the economy. What it needs to do is to create a market-based financial system that does a good job of allocating credit. Now, markets do make mistakes. Free financial markets do make mistakes. But the right way to think about it is to have effective regulation in place and to have the right incentives in place so that the financial sector does the right thing, and then the mistakes, when they happen, can be rectified. Likewise, if you think about the government's role in terms of promoting innovation, it's really to make sure that the private enterprises feel encouraged to do this, they get what is needed in terms of credit, but also a supporting institutional framework in terms of better corporate governance standards, in terms of better auditing and accounting frameworks, in terms of better government and corporate transparency. So these are the elements in which the government needs to play a role. But I think the big issue is really for the government to provide a very clear policy framework, which I'm hoping we'll see in the third plenum, which not only sets out what the government's objectives are, and I think we know those already, but really to think about the path that the government has in mind in order to get the economy to that place.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
It's not an easy time for real, honest discussions and sincere conversations. Yet, we know it's so important to do them now. This week, the annual meeting of the new champions aspires to be the platform to make them happen.
From the seashores of Dalian, we are bringing to you the updates about the latest of the world and also to meet the people from the world of business and innovation.
Follow me to the meeting rooms and session halls and take in the world and China you need to know.
Go to you, Dr. Jin. There are right perceptions and wrong perceptions, let me just put it that way, about realities of the Chinese economy and decision-making process, and the list goes on. So how do you, on the one hand, see people's debates about the role of the government, and also how do you see the competition going on within China, for example, between regions, on economic policy and economic approaches? Please.
Yes, if I can take this role of the state and perceptions from a slightly different angle, right? Let's look across the world. What are we seeing? We are seeing a return of the state, a very strong bang. How is it inspired? You know, where is the inspiration coming from? I think it's coming from China's success in these emerging strategic new sectors. Look at the revival of industrial policies. There's a return of that. Hundreds of $billions, CHIPS and Science Act, a Green Industrial Deal, Green New Deal in Europe, Japan, aiming to revive its semiconductors industry through hundreds of billions of dollars investment in high tech. UK talking about the digital economy and infrastructure and so forth, and return of the state. So if the model is so bad and so wrong, why is everybody copying that model with the role of the state? But here, let me be clear. We cannot narrowly interpret industrial policy, and coming back to your perception issue, as a mere subsidies, as merely financial subsidies. Some subsidy has worked in China, some others have worked less well. But what we do know is that the softer policies in that realm matter equally as much. For instance, like infrastructure. EV demand policy subsidies didn't work effectively until the EV charging stations are put in place. That's actually now a big infrastructure investment, talks in Europe and in the US. Similarly, coordination of supply chain, talent, coming back to the financial system. All of that is really important. But one really fundamental aspect of the state involvement is, does it actually ultimately promote competition? That we have seen repeatedly through the studies is that if industrial policies ultimately encourage competition, then by and large, they could have a very positive impact.
Very interesting discussion. I know, Aparna, you want to participate.
Well, I'm not an expert on government policy in China, but I can speak to it from how business leaders think about this, right? I do think that from a world to China perspective, there are opportunities for Chinese businesses still to be able to find growth all around the world. And I think, yes, government policy has something to do with it. For example, the RCEP, which is the largest FTA in the world, finds ways by which China can work closely with many of the nations, almost all the nations of Asia Pacific. And that opens up opportunities. So this kind of international trade deals can be a great conduit. The other thing that we are seeing is we're seeing more digital framework agreements and digital deals that are coming, that are dominantly digital in nature. Not a trade deal with a digital component, but dominantly digital in nature. ASEAN starting that first one, which hopefully gets signed in 2025. There are opportunities also for China to take a lead in the world stage to craft and to participate in those digital partnerships. The third thing I would say is I think Chinese businesses, coming more to my area of expertise, which is working with businesses, Chinese businesses can really find avenues for growth all over the world. One area, for example, is AI. We see that around Asia, all over Asia, our research shows that there's far more acceptance and openness for consumers to adopt AI-based solutions. Now, if you look at the same data in some of the Western markets, particularly Europe, Australia, etc., there is a net negative sentiment towards AI. So really benefiting from the net positive sentiment of the Asian consumers when it comes to AI applications would be another area of opportunity for Chinese businesses. Now, today, Chinese LLM models are not at the same quality as, frankly, the American LLM models, but the gap is closing, and there are opportunities in the future.
I do want to touch on 2 points that all of you almost raised or indicated. One is how the Chinese business community are digesting the realities, and as a result, their newest approach to whether you call it going overseas or going global, and what it might be its impact on both Chinese policymakers and also, of course, China's economic growth. Dr. Jin, go to you on that. Many of those sitting here in the audience, they have their companies operating in so many different parts of the world. It has already become almost the latest norm for companies, whether you call it Chinese companies or companies born in China, you name it. How do you see this latest approach is actually impacting on the mentality of policymakers and also the possible growth potential of this economy?
Well, I certainly think that is the next chapter, right? We're embarking on Chinese companies going global.
Remember, 20 years ago, there was another earlier campaign of Chinese company going global, but that was very different.
Very different.
Yes,
Traditional
indeed.
industries, and speaking about that, I find it highly ironic that despite the geopolitical tensions in U.S.-China, I think still 4 out of the 5 of the most downloaded apps in the U.S. today are Chinese apps. So that's one thing to take into account. It's a new model. Chinese traditional industries, manufacturing, all of that was kind of the old playbook, right? But Chinese new innovative business models, the digital economy, by the way, which is 40% of GDP as opposed to only 10% in the U.S. But even coming, back to India, right? China, the new comparative advantage in this new digital age has changed. It's not just oil, but it's data and it's algorithm, it's compute and all of that. So that is all changing. So I think there are real opportunities here because yes, Chinese business might have, in certain sectors, have some headwinds, geopolitically speaking, in the Western countries. There's still a lot of opportunities because Chinese technologies, the new crop of Chinese technologies are practical. They could be tailor-made, could be implemented very fast. They are cost-effective, and they could really be the cost-effective solution to many of the developing countries' present problems. So the question is how to grasp that opportunities, but of course there's still lots of cultural barriers. But as we're seeing, even against this whole geopolitical backdrop, we're seeing many, many more trade agreements being signed all over the world, a lot more regionalization, a lot more, trying to grasp the opportunities by Middle Eastern GCC countries or Southeast Asian economies. And we're seeing a huge amount of dynamism in, I don't want to call it the global South, but, ex-Western advanced economies. So I think Chinese companies have a lot of role to play there.
Mr. Peng, go to you on that. How do you see the landscape change internationally and now Chinese business community's approach to deal with it?
从我们面对这个环境是什么呢？我觉得是确实是百年未有之大变局。
What environment is that taking place in? There are changes unparalleled for a century or so in terms of politics and security, and especially geopolitics. And what's happened in geopolitics has been a serious stressor for the world. Now, it's very possible that the Russia-Ukraine war becomes an unending war, like in Kashmir. It's very hard to predict the results of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and there's a conflict going on in the Red Sea, and it involves energy and the transport of goods, so that has large potential impacts for global trade. But these aren't the most important issues. The big problem is the trend of deglobalization or anti-globalization. There's a new wave of unilateralism and protectionism in terms of discussion, but also what's being done in terms of policy. And that is a serious source of stress for the stability of China's growth. Now, there's been mention just now of U.S. actions against China's industries where China has an advantage, and they've been trying to limit or constrain China's exports. I mean, there's 100% duties being imposed on China's EVs by the U.S. Semiconductors, that's gone up to 50%. Raw materials, 25%. The European Union, for its part, is a very big part of the world economy. And this was an ex officio investigation by the authorities. There wasn't an application by the local industry, but they carried out an anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese EVs, and they're threatening in July to raise duties to 20 or 30-something%. These will have a major impact on the Chinese economy. So, as we look at internationalization by Chinese businesses, you have to take these factors into account. And China definitely doesn't look to engage in a trade war. The key is whether or not this can actually be dealt with by negotiations, consultations, and under the WTO framework. If that doesn't work, then China doesn't want to see a trade war, but is not afraid of one. New industries, in particular industries where China has advantage, have to be ones where China does continue to industrialize. Sometimes you have to have longer value chains. There's less imports into the U.S. directly from China, but there's some production taking place by Chinese companies elsewhere in the Americas and Southeast Asia and so on, so the total coming in has not changed. The U.S. has ostensibly been looking to protect its industry and consumers, but it's actually been damaging the world value chain and has also been increasing costs, which are ultimately borne by the U.S. consumer. That is bad news for globalization.
我觉得这个呢是对全球化呢是很不利的一个消息。
Professor Prasad, respond, please.
I have a strong belief that there are two forces. One is business dynamism and entrepreneurship, especially in our countries like China and India, and globalization. There are forces that are very difficult to stop because they have enormous benefits. There is one force, however, that can put significant roadblocks in their way, and those are governments. Governments responding, in their view, to domestic interests as well as their geopolitical views. And that, I think, is what we are seeing right now. In many countries, what we are seeing is that globalization's benefits have not necessarily gone to the masses. They've gone to the political and economic elite. I think forces like digitization that Keyu referred to are very important in making everybody in an economy feel that they have a vested interest in the success of their economy, vested interest in reforms, because they're all going to benefit from those. So what the governments need to do really is to make sure that they have the right kind of environment in place so that there can be more participation in the benefits of globalization. Likewise, if you think about governments putting hindrances in the way of broader forces of globalization, again, they're responding to domestic forces, and I think it's incumbent on governments, first of all, to make sure that they're helping in terms of building up and sustaining the international economic order, the rules-based system, which China has indeed tried to maintain, but I think it's very important for it to convince the rest of the world that it is taking that seriously in terms of giving American companies, Western companies, more broadly access to its markets and will play by the rules of the game. So I think these elements can really help in terms of changing the nature of the dialogue and unleashing these forces, which I think ultimately can create a lot of good for these economies, help them reorient their own growth models, and benefit the world at large.
Thank you. Aparna, do you have anything to add, very briefly?
Yes, maybe I can touch upon it from a business lens once again, and thinking of what is it that multinationals can do in the Chinese market, touching upon your last point. And essentially, I think multinationals need to, that operate in China, continue to value the China market, right? There are areas like automotive, medtech, etc., where China is a very important part of that business. The question will be, very briefly, a combination of innovation, a combination of finding lower cost solutions and to be able to find local for local solutions. And I think that combination is probably the one. But yes, it has to happen in an environment of open competition. It has to happen in an environment of multinationals getting access to that.
Right. Briefly respond, and before we go to the questions.
Just pulling us back to the Chinese domestic economy here for 1 second. Look, China is in transition, right? When we talk about these investments and strategies of high tech and newer sources of growth, these are the right things to do. But at the same time, we have to be very realistic about what that means in the short term and immediate run, right? Huge investment in technology. The fruits of that is going to take time, just as we've seen with the AI revolution. The real estate, to be offsetting the real estate investment with newer investment, well, real estate really provided a huge amount of growth and employment. So realistically, you still have to do many other things apart from high tech. For instance, service sector, again, only accounting for 47% of employment, 50% of growth, GDP. If you open that up, many young people, highly educated, can be absorbed. You can create a lot of opportunities, more social protection, and more flows of talent, people across the regions, reducing interregional trade. So we got to look at the challenges, but opportunities as well, but also be realistic of what all this means.
Wonderful. So let's open it up to the floor. I know I'm only asking some very preliminary questions. There are much smarter ones coming from our audience. They're practitioners. Their insights is very valuable. Let's have our microphones ready. Yes, thank you so much. We got hands already in the front line.
I'm from Agora Energy Transition in China. My question is addressed to Professor Jin Keyu and Professor Prasad. So, against the backdrop of rising geopolitical tension between United States and China, in case there is a second Trump presidency, what's the implications for European Union's China policy, especially EU's de-risking of supply chain strategies?
Under a Trump administration, the objectives in terms of the approach towards China are probably not going to be that different, but the precise elements of the strategy, the tactics might be quite different. You might have much more histrionics, you might have tariffs rather than the sort of measures the Biden administration has taken. But there is an important question about what role Europe will play in this. So the Biden administration has been much more effective at gathering together like-minded countries from the West in terms of their China policy. I think with Trump administration, we are likely to see much more fragmentation. Trump will do whatever he does, and he will not care that much about Europe. What Europe's response to that will be interesting, because it is possible that if Trump puts up even higher fences in the form of tariffs, restricts technology even more than a Biden administration might do, China might try to develop a less hostile relationship with Europe. But Europe, I think, feels as threatened as America does right now, because many of its ambitions of moving up towards higher tech industries, the new technology industries, are also seen as being threatened by China. So I don't think there is going to be a huge difference, but certainly Europe and the US will probably move together much more closely in a Biden administration. In a Trump administration, it will be more fragmented.
Professor Jin?
Very briefly, I just want to echo the brilliant remarks from the US-China panel and answering your question about the outcome of elections, which is it's a country, US, with allies and without allies. And neither president is good for China, but neither president candidate is good for the US either. And that was by my panel colleagues from the last panel. But if Trump comes in and imposes a 10% tariff, as he said, on everybody, right? Imagine the fact that there will be a certain reduction in potential GDP growth globally. Don't forget about Brexit and its permanent impact on the UK.
Aparna, what about for the others, since you're based in Southeast Asia?
Yes. No, I think, so a couple of things. One, from a US election standpoint, the US-China relationship is the only bilateral question. It's a question on which Democrats and Republicans directionally are similar, even though, of course, the policies and the execution, as you rightly said, might be different. So one thing that I think working with markets in the Global South and the rest of the world, we've come to realize is this is not a temporary situation. This is something you have to plan for the next decade or two. And that's how business leaders across the Global South are thinking of it. You can't wait this out, you have to plan for it. Now, with that in mind, most of the markets of the global south and business leaders in the global south would like to do business across geopolitical boundaries. They'd like to do business with all the major global economies of the world. And what they are starting to do and what we are seeing now is that what used to be a WTO overall regime is now becoming a tapestry of regional and multi-regional agreements where each set of countries are finding another set of countries that they can work with. It's a more complicated tapestry, but it is still pro-business when it comes to countries of the global south. Governments are trying to do pro-business moves that allow them to do business with the world. So I do think that does offer opportunities, but it's not as simple as saying if I'm WTO compliant, all is well, or oh, it's a two-polar world. It's not that simple. It's actually a multipolar situation with a tapestry of combinations that as business leaders we will need to understand and navigate in order to thrive.
We only, according to the official clock, 1 minute left. So as a moderator, I need to solicit all the best takeaways from today's discussion. And by the way, this is a joint production between the World Economic Forum and the CGTN. And I want to thank everyone participating in this discussion. Before we go, we talk about China's economic outlook. Mr. Peng said, let's come back to the topic. How do you see and how would you describe, using one word or two, about this outlook?
我想呢
Well, I think, as for the Chinese economy, there's a lot of hope. But there are a lot of difficulties as well. But thanks to reform and market-oriented reforms, we'll be prepared for a sustainable and healthy development. We will lay the groundwork.
I just say, make sure we keep China open for business and make sure we keep the world open for China.
Thank you. Professor Prasad?
So decent short-term prospects, and as for the longer term, good prospects if the government does the right thing.
Aparna, last but not least.
Thank you. All business leaders, no matter what industry, no matter what specialization, need to develop a geopolitical muscle to be able to thrive in the more complicated world.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your input and insight.